Imagine staring at a physical ledger from the year 1880, just this massive old book. You're looking at the balance sheet of a nation that literally walled itself off from the rest of the planet for, what, over 200 years?
Yeah, over 2 centuries of total isolation.
Right. A country with barely any natural resources, this incredibly fragmented, agrarian economy. And the people have just been forced onto the global stage because foreign gunboats literally showed up.
Commodore Perry and the Black Ships.
Exactly. So by all traditional economic logic, this nation should have just been swallowed whole, like completely absorbed by the rapidly expanding European empires of the time. They should have just been another colonial extraction point.
Right, another source of raw materials for the West. That was the standard playbook.
But, and here's where it gets wild, if you fast forward the pages of that ledger over the next 30 years, you see an explosion that just, it completely defies the laws of historical gravity. Between 1880 and 1910, their total export volume detonated by an incomprehensible 1,531%.
It's just a staggering number. I mean, we were talking about the Empire of Japan during the Meiji era, of course. And that 4,531% figure, it isn't just some statistical anomaly.
No, not at all.
It represents probably the most aggressive and honestly counterintuitive structural economic shift in modern history. Because, most people assume that when an emerging nation industrializes, they just copy the established powers.
Right, they see what works and mimic it.
Exactly. They figure out what the wealthy nations are buying, they manufacture a cheaper version of it, and they ship it straight back to those wealthy consumers in London or Paris or New York to try to crash the rich man's club.
Which is exactly what the conventional narrative tells us. Like, we're taught that Japan modernized just by imitating Western technology and flooding Western markets with cheap stuff. But today, we are doing a deep dive into a really groundbreaking National Bureau of Economic Research working paper.
Yeah, by economic historians Christopher M. Meisner and John P. Tang.
Right. The paper is called Upstart, Industrialization and Exports, Japan, 1880-1910. And the data they've uncovered completely destroys that traditional narrative. It's a total paradigm shift.
It really is.
Because to become a global superpower, Japan didn't crash the rich man's club. They deliberately abandoned it. They literally turned their backs on the most lucrative consumer markets on Earth and shifted almost their entire strategic focus to their poorer, developing neighbors in Asia.
Yeah, the historical records show it was a highly calculated pivot. They executed what we could call this dimension strike. They realized that trying to fight the entrenched heavyweights of Europe head-to-head in Western markets, I mean, it's just a losing proposition.
A total non-starter.
Exactly. So they changed the battlefield entirely. They sought out these overlooked massive markets where the established powers were either absent or at a huge geographic disadvantage. And they just learned to dominate the rules of industrial trade in the shadows, basically.
And I think that's why if you are building a business or launching a new product or just, trying to understand how massive structural shifts actually happen in any competitive environment, this deep dive is your blueprint.
Oh, absolutely. It's a masterclass in strategy.
Because what Meissner and Tang prove is that explosive, world-altering growth rarely comes from just walking into the champion's backyard and challenging them to a fight. It comes from finding your own completely ignored playground.
Right. And to really understand how this pivot worked, we have to look at the methodology Meisner and Tang used.
Yeah.
Because they didn't just rely on, high-level summaries or some secondary historical accounts written 50 years later.
They went straight to the raw data, right?
Straight to the primary sources. We are talking about the Dai Nippon Taikoku Boki Nenpyo.
Oh, wow. Good pronunciation.
Thanks. Which translates to the annual return of the foreign trade of the Empire of Japan. And these were massive, physically imposing books published by the Japanese Ministry of Finance. They were filled with handwritten ink entries detailing every single item that entered or left a Japanese port.
Let's just visualize that for a second. We aren't talking about nice, clean Excel spreadsheets here. We are talking about researchers meticulously digitizing 30 years of fragile 19th century customs records.
Yeah, page by page. They tracked the data in 5-year intervals from 1880 to 1910, and they mapped the exact DNA of every single shipment leaving Japan.
And they categorized, what was it, 116 unique products across 31 different global destinations?
Exactly, 116 unique products. And the level of granularity here is what makes this study so powerful. They utilized a standardized classification system called SITC Revision 2.
Okay, I have to pause you there because SITC Revision 2 sounds incredibly dry. I mean, why do we, or anyone listening who wants to understand global growth, why do we care about the specific academic categorization system they used?
That's a fair question. Because a 19th century Japanese customs clerk and a 21st century economic historian speak completely different languages when it comes to what a manufactured good actually is.
Oh, like the definitions change over time.
Right. In 1880, a clerk might categorize a roughly spun bundle of silk very differently than, say, a fully woven silk garment. By applying that SITC Revision 2 framework, the researchers essentially translated that chaotic, archaic 19th century trade terminology into a modern, standardized format.
So it's like a universal translator for economic data.
Exactly. It allows us to objectively separate raw materials from complex industrial goods. And once that data was cleaned and standardized, the researchers could clearly separate the intensive margin from the extensive margin.
Okay, let's avoid the academic jargon for a second. Let's call the intensive margin the status quo strategy and the extensive margin the blank canvas strategy.
I like that. That works well.
Because the status quo strategy is what traditional economic theory dictates a poor country should do, right? The whole theory of comparative advantage.
Right, which says that if you are a resource-poor agrarian nation with a massive, cheap labor force, and your climate is perfect for growing green tea and harvesting raw silk.
You should just dedicate all your energy to producing more tea and more silk. You sell more of your legacy products to the buyers who already want them.
And the data confirms that a large portion of Japan's initial export volume did come from that status quo strategy.
Right.
They heavily scared up their exports of raw silk.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, if they had only followed that comparative advantage, they would have hit a hard ceiling.
Because there's only so much tea the world can drink.
Exactly. The global demand for tea and raw silk is finite. They would have remained a peripheral, second-tier agricultural supplier to the Western empires. They never would have industrialized.
And this is where the researchers uncovered that massive structural leap. The data revealed that a massive 30% of Japan's staggering 1,531% export growth came entirely from the blank canvas strategy.
30%, yeah.
They weren't just pumping out more silk, they were dedicating an immense amount of national energy and capital to selling completely new products to completely new markets.
It was a fundamental transformation of their product catalog. I mean, in 1880, Japan exported 67 distinct types of goods.
Okay.
By 1910, that number had surged to 116. And we aren't just talking about new flavors of tea here. We are talking about a structural evolution from shipping raw, unprocessed agricultural yield to exporting complex, manufactured industrial goods.
Like what?
They began aggressively shipping items like finished cotton yarn, complex machinery, and refined metals to destinations they had never previously traded with.
Now put yourself in the shoes of a Japanese business leader or a government minister in the 1880s. This is an incredibly terrifying strategic move.
Oh, the risk is unbelievable.
You're a developing nation with extremely limited capital. Every single yen is precious. Taking that scarce capital and risking it on untested, complex industrial products, and then trying to sell them in completely foreign, untested markets, I mean, that is a bet-the-nation pivot.
The risk profile is astronomical. They were going up against entrenched European powers. The British, the French, the Germans, nations that had been perfecting steam power, mechanized looms, and industrial metallurgy for a century.
Right. They practically invented it.
Exactly. The Europeans had established distribution networks, deep pockets, and decades of institutional knowledge. Japan was stepping into this highly complex arena entirely from scratch.
It totally reminds me of a legacy company trying to survive a technological revolution. Imagine like a massive traditional typewriter manufacturer in the mid-1970s.
Okay.
The board of directors sits down and announces, over the next 10 years, 30% of our revenue must come from inventing this theoretical machine called a personal computer.
And we're going to sell it everywhere.
Right, and we're going to sell it in countries where we currently have 0 offices, 0 brand recognition, and 0 logistics networks. The shareholders would probably revolt. But Japan executed this exact pivot on a macroeconomic scale.
And the most fascinating part of this pivot is where they chose to sell these new industrial goods. Because if you have just successfully manufactured your country's first batch of high-quality, industrial-grade cotton yarn or heavy machinery,
The natural inclination is to seek out the buyers with the deepest pockets.
Exactly. You want to recoup your massive research and development costs.
You want to go to London. You want to go to Paris. You want to go to New York. You want to sell to the wealthiest consumers on the planet because they actually have the disposable income to buy complex manufactured goods.
But the customs ledgers show they did the exact opposite. They initiated a deliberate downgrade strike.
A downgrade strike. I love that phrasing.
Right. During the late 19th century, the first true wave of modern globalization was in full swing. The British Empire and other Western powers were relentlessly expanding their reach, extracting raw materials globally, and aggressively selling their advanced manufactured goods in every port they could access.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
But Japan actively cold-shouldered the wealthiest buyers on Earth.
The numbers on this are stark. In 1880, 80% of all Japanese exports were bound for the wealthy markets of North America and Europe. 80%. They were feeding the Western beast. But by 1910, that share had plummeted to 60%, and simultaneously, their exports to their poorer Asian neighbors skyrocketed from a mere 20% to nearly 40%. They literally, physically redirected their merchant fleets away from the West.
The new epicenters for Japanese trade became China, British India, the Korean Peninsula, and Hong Kong. And to grasp the mechanics of why they made this dramatic geographic shift, we have to examine the single most important product in this whole historical narrative.
Okay, what is it?
We need to look at the cotton yarn surprise.
Oh, the cotton data. The cotton data is genuinely mind-bending because in 1880, Japan was drowning in imported cotton. They did not have a mechanized textile industry capable of meeting domestic demand, so they were buying massive quantities of finished cotton goods from Western nations.
Which was a massive drain on their national wealth.
Exactly. Yet, flash forward a mere 30 years to 1910, cotton yarn was no longer an import. It was Japan's undisputed #1 export powerhouse. It constituted a staggering 42% of all their global exports.
They transitioned from a helpless importer to the dominant supplier in the Asian market in a single generation.
Unbelievable.
And the true gravity of this achievement only becomes clear when you understand the geopolitical handicap they were operating under.
Right.
Because when a developing nation attempts to build a brand new domestic industry like mechanized textiles, they almost universally utilize one specific economic tool: protective tariffs.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this because it seems like the obvious solution. If Japan was bleeding capital by importing British cotton in 1880, why didn't the Meiji government just slap a massive 50% import tax on all British textiles?
That's the logical move, right?
Yeah. That would instantly make the British goods prohibitively expensive. It would force Japanese consumers to buy locally made cotton and give their infant textile factories the breathing room and revenue they needed to figure out how to scale. Isn't that exactly how Alexander Hamilton protected early American manufacturing, or how Germany built its industrial base?
It is exactly how America and Germany industrialized. The problem is, Japan legally couldn't do it.
Why not?
Remember when American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay in 1853 with heavily armed warships? He didn't just force Japan to open its ports. He forced them to sign what became known as the unequal treaties.
Ah, the unequal treaties.
And a core component of these treaties was the complete stripping of Japan's tariff autonomy.
So the Western powers essentially dictated Japan's tax policy just to ensure their own goods could flood the market.
Precisely. Japan's import tariffs were artificially capped by foreign powers at absurdly low levels, generally below 5% all the way until the early 1900s. They were legally prohibited from building a protective tariff wall. So they had to foster an infant industrial base in a completely open free market arena. They were fighting the industrial heavyweights of Manchester and Lancashire with their hands tied behind their backs, entirely exposed to the full force of British manufacturing efficiency.
See, this makes the 531% growth even more absurd to me. They are competing in a completely unprotected ring against the reigning champions, and they somehow score a knockout.
It really is incredible.
But this brings us back to the core puzzle. If they were forced into a free market fight anyway, why did they actively pivot away from the wealthy American and European markets and aim for Asia?
It was a cold, ruthless calculation of geographic gravity.
Yeah.
The Japanese understood that they could not beat the British in London.
Right.
The transportation costs, the established domestic monopolies, and the technological gap were just too vast. However, they realized they might be able to beat the British in India or China.
Because of the map. They weaponized proximity.
Exactly. Geography became their singular asymmetrical advantage. I mean, think about shipping heavy, low-margin industrial goods like cotton yarn from the mills of Manchester all the way around the Cape of Good Hope or through the newly opened Suez Canal and then across the Indian Ocean to Bombay.
That incurs massive freight costs.
Massive. It took immense amounts of time and fuel, but Japan, situated on the eastern edge of Asia, could ship from Osaka to Shanghai or Bombay in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost.
Wow.
They needed an arena to learn the painful, complex ropes of industrialization, and they chose the one arena where their European competitors suffered from a massive geographic penalty.
So they couldn't build a legal tariff wall, so they used the Pacific and Indian Oceans as a physical tariff wall against the Europeans?
That's exactly it.
That is brilliant. But choosing Asia creates a massive economic paradox.
How so?
Well, the established rule of wealth dictates that to get rich, you have to sell to the rich. If Japan was intentionally targeting poorer nations, how did they generate enough capital to fuel a 1,500% boom?
Ah, you are referencing one of the bedrock theories of international trade, the Linder hypothesis.
The Linder hypothesis. Explain that one.
So the economist Staffan Burenstam Linder proposed that a country's export profile is fundamentally tied to its domestic income level. And the logic is quite sound. As a nation becomes wealthier and more industrialized, its domestic consumers begin demanding more complex, higher quality, sophisticated goods.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. And consequently, the nation's factories learn to produce those sophisticated goods.
Right, and once you are producing high-end, complex goods, the only people who can afford to buy them are consumers in other wealthy, industrialized nations. Therefore, rich countries inevitably end up trading primarily with other rich countries.
And poor countries, producing basic agricultural goods or cheap crafts, trade with other poor countries, the rich-to-rich theory.
Right, so under the Linder hypothesis, as Japan rapidly industrialized and evolved from exporting raw silk to exporting complex machinery and finished textiles, their trade should have inevitably skewed heavier and heavier toward the advanced economies of the United States, Britain, and France.
Their new, sophisticated products should have demanded sophisticated, wealthy buyers.
But the customs ledgers completely obliterate the Linder hypothesis in this specific historical context, don't they?
They really do. As Japan moved up the industrial ladder, manufacturing highly advanced goods, they intentionally aimed their sales pitch downward. The data shows that Japan's new advanced industrial goods had a success rate in poorer, less developed countries that was fundamentally disproportionate.
The disparity is just massive. When Meissner and Tang analyzed the growth contribution of completely new products, they found it accounted for 4.54% of export growth in less developed countries compared to a mere 1% in advanced economies. Japan's high-end industrial innovations were finding a market in poorer nations at a rate 4 times higher than in the wealthy West. They were actively defying the accepted rules of wealth accumulation.
And anyone who has ever tried to expand a business into a foreign territory knows that entering a new market is a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolute nightmare.
You do not just load a steamship full of cotton yarn, sail it to a random port in Asia,
Right,
and hope someone on the docks wants to buy it.
No, the fixed costs of entering a new market in the late 19th century were staggering. You have to navigate completely alien regulatory environments. You have to establish lines of credit with foreign banks that have absolutely no reason to trust you.
You have to find local distributors who won't cheat you. You have to figure out maritime insurance, local consumer preferences, secure warehouse space. All of these require massive upfront outlays of capital before a single yen of profit is realized.
You only endure that level of pain and expense if you are absolutely certain the market is large enough to eventually pay you back. You need scale.
Exactly. You need scale. Yeah. And the researchers wanted to understand the algorithm Japan used to pick their targets.
Right.
When deploying their blank canvas strategy, launching a brand new industrial product, how do they decide which country to enter first? You might assume they simply picked the nation closest to their shores to minimize those terrifying shipping costs.
Like Korea or the nearest Chinese port.
Right. But the regression analysis proves proximity wasn't the primary driver. They executed what we can call a beachhead strategy. The data reveals they systematically targeted the countries with the absolute highest gross domestic product available to them in the region.
So they didn't just want a nearby testing ground, they demanded the absolute biggest playground possible.
They needed sheer volume to justify the immense upfront fixed costs of entry. I mean, if you're going to spend the time and capital to figure out the labyrinthine logistics of the textile trade in British India, you do it because capturing even a fraction of a percent of the massive Indian consumer market will generate enough absolute revenue to cover your initial losses and fund your factory back home.
Let me put this into a modern context. Think about a tech startup launching a highly complex, server-heavy social networking app today. You don't soft launch that app in a tiny rural town of 500 people just because that town happens to be a 20-minute drive from your headquarters.
No, the friction of acquiring users and the cost of keeping the servers running will bankrupt you.
Exactly. Because the total addressable market is too small to ever hit critical mass, the local proximity is totally relevant if the volume isn't there.
So what do?
You launch that app on a massive, densely populated college campus. Even if it requires more initial effort to market to 40,000 students, the sheer density and volume guarantee that if the product catches on, you immediately achieve the scale necessary to cover your development costs. Japan looked at the map of Asia and saw massive college campuses in China and India.
I love that analogy, yes. They absorbed the high risk and fixed costs of entry because the absolute market size of those high GDP Asian nations provided a mathematical guarantee of scale if the product succeeded.
But that if is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Going from 0 to 1 in global trade is historically brutal. A vast number of products simply die on the vine. A manufacturer sends one shipment, takes a loss, and gives up.
True. And this is where the paper reveals what feels like a hidden cheat code in the data. The researchers built a statistical tool to track the survival rate of these products. They call it a status transition matrix.
It is a fascinating way to visualize the data. A status transition matrix essentially acts as a longitudinal tracking grid, right?
Yeah, it isolates a specific product, say a specific gauge of copper wire, and watches its performance year over year. It tracks whether the product enters a new market, expands its volume, shrinks, or completely dies and exits the global market entirely.
And this matrix revealed a very rigid, almost magical threshold. Let's call it the magic number 6.
The magic number 6.
The data showed that if a Japanese product was only being exported to 1 or 2 destination countries, it was living in a high-risk danger zone. It faced a roughly 20% chance of failing completely.
Which is entirely logical. If you are a Japanese foundry and you only have 2 foreign clients buying your copper wire, and one of those countries experiences a domestic recession or a sudden change in import regulations.
Half your export market vanishes overnight.
Exactly. Your factory can't sustain the loss, and you stop exporting. You are completely exposed to localized volatility.
But the matrix showed that if a product could somehow claw its way into more than 6 distinct destination countries, the exit rate, the chance of that product dying out, plummeted off a cliff. The product essentially became immortal.
Immortal is a strong word, but statistically, yeah. Over the entire 30 years covered in the study, spanning 1,703 distinct market entries for various goods, only 269 products ever suffered a permanent failure.
The survival rate is extraordinary. Once a product breached that threshold of 6 destinations, it achieved a state of path dependency. It locked in. The matrix demonstrates that products in that 6+ category didn't just survive, they fanned out globally with an almost exponential success rate.
They really did.
So, why 6? Is there something mathematically magical about that specific number, or does it represent a deeper behavioral shift within the Japanese economy?
It represents the crystallization of the learning effect. When a Japanese firm entered those first few markets, they weren't primarily accumulating financial profit. In many cases, they were likely operating at a loss.
Okay, so what were they accumulating?
What they were actively accumulating was export capability. They were learning the mechanics of international trade.
They were learning how to export, not just what to export.
Precisely. Let's think about the sheer logistical friction involved in the late 19th century. You have a factory manager in Osaka who has to figure out which specific type of wooden crate can survive a 3-week voyage across the South China Sea without the contents rusting or rotting.
Right.
They have to learn how to negotiate maritime insurance contracts with British brokers. They have to understand the intricacies of foreign exchange rates and how to bribe or negotiate with port customs authorities in 5 different languages.
It's like a modern software company trying to set up an international supply chain or localize an iOS app.
Right.
Doing it for the very first time in Germany is agonizing. You have to hire lawyers, figure out the European Union tax code, rewrite your privacy policy, translate your entire
It
interface.
might take 6 months and cost a fortune.
Exactly. Doing it a second time for France is slightly easier, but still painful. But by the time your company has localized that software for 6 completely different nations with 6 different tax codes and languages, you no longer just have a product. You have built an entirely new internal department dedicated exclusively to localization.
The institutional knowledge is locked in.
Right. You have templates, you have legal frameworks, you have a trained staff. So when the CEO says, let's launch in a seventh country, it doesn't take 6 months. It takes a week. The friction has been eradicated.
This is exactly what the Japanese export sector achieved. By grinding through the excruciating fixed costs of learning to operate in 6 unique, difficult markets, the 7th market became virtually free from a learning perspective. The momentum became exponential because the structural hurdles of trade had been permanently dismantled by the institutional muscle memory of the firms.
See, the takeaway here is profound for anyone launching a new initiative. We obsess over total global domination on day one. We want to be everywhere at once.
Always.
But the Meiji Customs data suggests you should stop worrying about the whole world. Worry obsessively about surviving your first 6 distinct victories. Endure the friction of those first 6 clients or markets, because once you have built the institutional machinery to handle that complexity, the system essentially takes over and scales itself.
Right. The fixed costs of learning are amortized, and every subsequent market entry is pure high-margin expansion.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of the listener.
Go for it.
You are listening to this, and you are hearing that Japan heavily targeted less developed, lower-income markets like British India and Qing Dynasty China. They actively avoided the wealthy buyers in London and New York. The immediate cynical conclusion is that Japan was simply pumping out cheap, low-quality garbage.
That's the stereotype, right?
Yeah. They couldn't meet Western standards, so they dumped inferior goods on poorer nations. For over a century, cheap and inferior was the global stereotype of early Japanese manufacturing.
It's the most common assumption made about their early industrialization. If you are selling exclusively to the poorest markets, the logic dictates you must be cutting corners and manufacturing the worst possible products.
Right.
However, Meisner and Tang conducted a deep dive into the massive British Indian market that reveals a highly counterintuitive reality. Japan did not win by lowering their quality. They won by systematically hacking the invisible costs of the trade system.
So the researchers isolated the Indian market because it serves as the perfect historical battleground. You had the British, the French, the Belgians, and the Japanese all brutally competing to sell cotton goods to the same consumers.
And the data shows Japan ruthlessly stealing massive chunks of market share away from the European powers.
But here is the critical data point. When the researchers looked at the unit value of the Japanese goods, which is an economic proxy for the price the consumer pays, Japan's prices were dropping significantly relative to their European competitors.
And in standard economic analysis, a steadily dropping price usually signals a corresponding drop in quality. You use cheaper raw materials, you use less skilled labor, and you produce a cheaper good.
But the contemporary records and the sustained market dominance suggest that wasn't the case at all. I mean, if they were selling garbage, the market would have eventually rejected them once the initial novelty wore off.
Yeah.
But their market share just kept growing. They achieved cheapness not by degrading the product, but through spectacular, almost unbelievable gains in production efficiency and a systematic obliteration of trade costs.
They were delivering the same, or even slightly better, quality of cotton yarn, but it was costing them drastically less to get it from the factory floor into the hands of the Indian consumer.
Which presents a massive macroeconomic puzzle. How do trade costs drop so precipitously for an entire nation over such a short period?
Well, global shipping technology. The transition from sail to steam was improving, but that benefited the British and French just as much as it benefited the Japanese.
Right, everyone had steamships.
Japan possessed an asymmetrical advantage. And it wasn't just the private textile companies achieving this on their own. This is where we uncover the secret government hand.
Oh, this aspect of the story reads like an economic spy thriller. The Japanese government, as we discussed, was handcuffed by the unequal treaties. They couldn't use tariffs. They couldn't build a protective wall around their industries.
So they decided to build a hyper-efficient, heavily subsidized bridge to the rest of the world instead.
They weaponized macroeconomic policy and diplomacy as hidden subsidies. Let's look first at monetary policy. In 1897, the Meiji government made the monumental decision to officially adopt the gold standard.
Which on the surface sounds like the most boring bureaucratic maneuver imaginable.
Very boring.
But in the context of 19th century trade, it was a superpower move. Explain the mechanics of why shifting to the gold standard acted as a massive steroid for Japanese exporters.
Okay, let's create a hypothetical scenario to understand the friction of 19th century currency markets. Imagine you are Taro, a Japanese merchant in Osaka in 1890. Japan's currency is based on silver. You buy raw cotton from a domestic supplier using silver yen.
Okay.
You spin it into yarn, load it onto a ship, and send it to Bombay, India, where it will be sold in rupees, which are tied to the British pound. The voyage takes weeks. During those weeks, a massive silver mine is discovered in Nevada, flooding the global market. The global value of silver plummets relative to gold and the British pound.
So by the time Taro's ship arrives in Bombay, the silver yen he used to calculate his costs is suddenly worth 20% less on the global market.
Exactly. Taro sold the yarn at his expected price in rupees. But when he converts that money back into his devalued silver yen, his entire profit margin for the year is wiped out by currency fluctuation.
And when you are operating a nascent industrial business on razor-thin margins, that level of mathematical anxiety is paralyzing. It is a massive, invisible trade cost that prevents you from scaling.
But by adopting the gold standard in 1897, Japan pegged the yen directly to gold.
By tying their currency to gold, the Japanese government instantly aligned themselves with the monetary system of their major trading partners, including the British Empire. Overnight, they eradicated the currency fluctuation risk for every exporter in the country.
So Taro the merchant no longer has to worry about the global price of silver while his ship is at sea. He knows exactly what his profit will be.
The government eliminated a massive layer of risk, which translates directly into lower operating costs, allowing Japanese firms to lower their prices in India without lowering their quality.
And while the finance ministry was stabilizing the currency, the foreign ministry was deploying the diplomats. The Japanese government constructed a massive, globally dispersed network of consulates.
And these diplomats were not dispatched merely to sip tea, attend state dinners, and stamp visas. They were essentially acting as a free, highly trained, government-funded intelligence agency for Japanese manufacturers.
It is a brilliant utilization of state resources. The consulates were operating as forward observation posts. They were constantly gathering granular market intelligence and feeding it directly back to Tokyo.
They answered the fundamental questions that usually bankrupt a company trying to enter a new market.
Like what?
Like, what specific thread count do the consumers in Bombay prefer? What exact price are the British textile firms charging in Shanghai this month? Who are the reliable local distributors, and who are the swindlers?
It's the equivalent of a government today providing free enterprise-level data analytics, consumer trend reports, and McKinsey consulting services to every single startup in the country.
It really is.
If you are a Japanese cotton manufacturer, you do not have to spend your own precious capital guessing what the Indian market wants or sending your own scouts to survey the docks. Your government has already handed you a meticulously researched dossier.
They completely destroyed the fixed costs of information gathering. I just marvel at the silent coordination of this strategy.
Same.
The government could not legally protect their companies from foreign competition at home, so they subsidized the intelligence gap, giving them the ultimate informational advantage abroad.
It allowed Japanese firms to aggressively undercut European prices, not by cutting corners on the factory floor or abusing their workforce, but by eliminating the massive invisible inefficiencies of operating blindly in international trade.
Exactly. So they have weaponized proximity, they have stabilized their currency, and they have state-sponsored intelligence guiding their market entry.
But there's one final overarching factor that makes Japan the ultimate anomaly of this era. They were the only non-Western industrialized nation. Geographically, they were incredibly isolated from the traditional centers of industrial power, finance, and technological innovation in Europe and America.
Right. And in the context of globalization, being thousands of miles away from the center of action is usually a death sentence.
In many ways, their isolation should have relegated them to obscurity, but they transformed that isolation into their ultimate fortress. We can conceptualize them as the regional lone wolf.
Because Japan was geographically marooned on the edge of the Pacific, any European manufacturer trying to reach those massive, lucrative Asian consumer markets had to pay exorbitant shipping premiums.
Right. Japan's sheer loneliness gave them a massive, impenetrable home field advantage in freight costs.
This geographic reality leads us to one of the most elegant and counterintuitive statistical findings in the entire paper, the price illusion.
The price illusion. Let's unpack that.
We discussed earlier how Japan deliberately pivoted away from the wealthy U.S. and European markets. However, they were still exporting some goods to the West. And if you look at the raw, unadjusted customs data, an interesting pattern emerges.
Okay.
The rich Western countries were consistently paying higher unit prices for Japanese goods than the poorer Asian countries were paying for the exact same categories of goods.
Ah. So a traditional economist looks at that raw data and says, aha, the Linder hypothesis is real after all. Japan is manufacturing premium, high-quality luxury goods and sending them to the rich Westerners who can afford them, and they are taking the cheap, defective, low-quality goods and dumping them in the Asian markets.
Exactly. For decades, that was the unquestioned assumption. It neatly fit the established economic models,
What?
but Meisner and Tang decided to test that assumption. They ran complex regression models on the data, and they statistically stripped away the cost of distance.
They mathematically removed the exorbitant sheer cost of shipping heavy goods across the Pacific Ocean to San Francisco or all the way around the Cape of Good Hope to London.
Yes. And when they removed the shipping costs from the equation, what happened to the price discrepancy?
The quality difference completely evaporated. It was an illusion.
The rich Western countries were not paying a premium for better quality Japanese goods. They were just paying for the extra thousands of miles of ocean.
They were quite literally just paying for the boats. The intrinsic value and quality of the goods sent to New York were virtually identical to the goods sent to Shanghai. The markup was entirely consumed by the logistics of crossing the globe.
It's the exact phenomenon you experience with a modern food delivery app.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison. You look at your final receipt and think, wow, I am paying a massive 30% premium for this artisan burger. But the physical burger hasn't changed. The restaurant isn't using better beef because you ordered it on an app.
You are just paying a massive invisible fee to the delivery driver for navigating traffic all the way across town.
Exactly. The product itself isn't more premium. The logistics required to get it to your door are just exponentially more expensive.
What is so fascinating here is how trade costs, the shipping freight, the maritime insurance, the information asymmetry, the currency risk act as the invisible dark matter of the global economy.
The dark matter.
Yeah. When we study economic history or even modern business, we obsess over the physical product itself. We look at the quality of the cotton yarn or the design of the machinery and assume the product's attributes dictate its success.
But the Japanese economic miracle was largely built on mastering the dark matter, the invisible space between the products and the buyers.
By utilizing their geographic isolation in Asia, they turned a weakness into a moat. They used the high shipping costs of the Europeans as an invisible natural tariff, protecting them in their local Asian markets.
It gave them the breathing room they were legally denied by the unequal treaties.
Right. They used that breathing room to rapidly absorb Western technology, mix it with their own highly efficient production systems, and catch up to the leading Western economies at a speed the world had never before witnessed.
And by the time the European powers truly realized the magnitude of what was happening in the East, Japan was no longer just a plucky upstart. They had achieved a massive scale. They had the institutional muscle memory of the magic number 6 working for them across dozens of complex product lines.
They were an entrenched, heavily armed industrial superpower, capable of dictating the terms of trade in their hemisphere.
Man, let's pull all of these threads together and synthesize the ultimate blueprint. Japan's 1,531% economic explosion was not a lucky accident of history. It was not merely the result of imitation or selling cheap.
Far from it.
It was driven by the blank canvas strategy, the deliberate, terrifying venture into entirely new markets with entirely new industrial products, which ultimately accounted for 30% of their unprecedented growth.
It was about ruthlessly identifying and cutting the invisible costs of trade while their competitors remained fixated on traditional tariffs.
And, crucially, it was about recognizing the immense value of the overlooked. They utilized their massive developing Asian neighbors as the ultimate testing ground to master the Western game of industrialization, far away from the center of Western power and scrutiny.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to apply this framework today.
Yeah, I want you, the listener, to apply this framework to your own life, your own career, or your own business strategy. We all face entrenched competitors who seem to hold all the advantages. More capital, more connections, a longer history.
The instinct is always to try and beat them at their own game, in their own backyard.
But the Meiji customs ledgers ask us to look elsewhere. Where is your Asian testing ground? Where is the overlooked, perhaps less glamorous but massive market or niche where you can test your ideas?
Where can you build your institutional muscle memory and reach your own magic number 6 without having to fight the heavyweights head-on from day one?
Where can you launch your own downgrade strike?
That is the intensely practical, personal takeaway. But if we pull the lens back and connect this century-old data to the macroeconomic picture of our world today, there is a lingering, somewhat provocative historical question we really must confront.
What's that?
Today, we are living through a period where the era of frictionless hyperglobalization seems to be violently retreating. Anti-globalization sentiments are rising globally. Tariff walls, which had been steadily lowered for decades, are rapidly going back up around the world.
Nations are once again turning to protectionism.
Exactly. But a century ago, Japan rose to unprecedented global power without the ability to use tariff protections. They were forced to navigate a brutal open system, and they won by deploying this brilliant dimension strike diving into lower-tier markets, innovating rapidly on the extensive margin, and mastering the invisible costs of trade.
They couldn't win the game they were forced to play, so they fundamentally changed the board they were playing on.
Exactly. So the historical question we are left with is this. Are we currently witnessing the definitive end of the modern era of hyperspecialization, where emerging nations simply assumed they would trade freely with the richest nations to grow?
Oh, wow.
And as our modern world becomes increasingly fractured, regionalized, and protectionist, is a modernized version of Japan's century-old blank canvas strategy finding overlooked regional markets and ruthlessly optimizing those invisible trade costs, is that the only true code left for an emerging player or an emerging nation to survive and become a superpower.
That is a heavy, fascinating thought to chew on as you look at the changing economic map of the world today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history. Keep questioning the accepted narratives, look for the blank canvas in your own field, and we will see you next time.